You are standing in a narrow street in the ancient city of Nippur, sometime around 2000 before Common Era. The sun is already high. The mud brick walls on either side of you radiate the accumulated heat of the morning. You can hear, from somewhere nearby, the sound of young voices reciting in unison. This is a rhythmic, repetitive chanting that rises and falls like a kind of musical exercise. The sound is coming from a building that looks, from the outside, much like any other house in this quarter of the city. There is no grand entrance, no imposing columns or decorated gateway, just a simple doorway, and beyond it, the voices of children. This is what the Sumerians called the Dub Ba'ar. It translates quite literally as the House of Tablets. You might think of it as a school, though that word carries associations that do not quite fit. Samuel Noah Kramer, the renowned Assyriologist, devoted considerable attention to these institutions. He spent much of his career deciphering Sumerian texts. In his writings, particularly in his work titled The Sumerians, Their History, Culture, and Character, Kramer pieced together a remarkably detailed picture of these institutions. He described what happened inside these houses and who attended them. He also explained what education meant in the world's first urban civilization. The Dub Ba'ar was not a place for everyone. You need to understand this from the outset. In Sumerian society, literacy was not a universal skill. It was also not considered necessary for most people to acquire it. The vast majority of the population lived their entire lives without ever learning to read or write. This group included farmers, canal laborers, women who processed grain and textiles, and fishermen. This was not seen as a deficiency. These people had their own forms of knowledge and expert. This knowledge was passed down through direct observation and practice. However, the scribal arts were different. They required years of dedicated study. These arts opened doors to positions of influence and relative comfort. The students who entered the Dub Ba'ar were almost exclusively boys. They came from families that could afford to do without their labor. These families could also pay the fees required for instruction. Kramer's translations of Sumerian literary texts reveal that the student's day began early, often before dawn. A composition known as School Days provides a first-person account of a typical student's experience. Kramer translated and analyzed this text extensively. It offers at least a stylized literary representation of school life. In this text, the student describes waking up and asking his mother for his lunch. He then hurried to school, arriving to find the teacher already present and watchful. You might imagine that ancient education would be a gentle affair. It might seem filled with patience and encouragement. However, the evidence suggests otherwise. The Sumerian school was a place of strict discipline and frequent punishment. The School Days text catalogues a series of infractions and their consequences. It does so with an almost weary familiarity. The student speaks poorly and is caned. He stands up without permission and is caned. He leaves the school grounds without authorization and is caned. The teacher responsible for overseeing behavior was called the man in charge of the whip. This figure is mentioned repeatedly in school texts. His title alone suggests the atmosphere of these institutions. But what were these students actually learning? The curriculum of the Dub Ba'ar was intensely focused on a single skill. That skill was the mastery of cuneiform writing. Cuneiform, with its wedge-shaped marks pressed into soft clay, was not a simple system. It had evolved over centuries from pictographic symbols into a complex script. This script combined logograms, signs representing entire words, with phonetic elements, signs representing sounds. Kramer studied the Old Babylonian period most intensively. This period was roughly from 2000 to 1600, before Common Era. By this time, the system included hundreds of signs, many of which had multiple possible readings depending on context. The beginning student started with the most basic elements. You would receive a lump of clay, carefully prepared to the right consistency. It was neither too wet nor too dry. You would be shown how to hold the reed stylus. You would learn how to angle it and how to apply pressure to create the characteristic wedge shape. Your first exercises would involve making individual signs over and over until the muscle memory became automatic. Kramer discovered numerous practice tablets from ancient school sites. These artifacts are remarkably revealing. You can see the student's progression. The first attempts are often crude, with lines wavering or poorly formed. Gradually, over the course of many tablets, the signs became more assured and more uniform. Once you had mastered individual signs, you moved on to sign lists. These were long compilations that organized cuneiform signs according to various principles. These included shape, sound, and semantic category. You would copy these lists repeatedly. You would memorize not just the signs, but also their various possible readings and meanings. Some of these sign lists contained hundreds of entries. Kramer noted that fragments of these lists appear so frequently in archaeological contexts. This suggests they formed the backbone of scribal education for generations. After sign lists came word lists, which were organized thematically. There were lists of trees, stones, animals, and professions. There were also lists of tools. These lists served multiple purposes. They helped you expand your vocabulary. They also provided you with a kind of encyclopedic knowledge of the world as the Sumerians categorized it. You learned not just how to write the word for carpenter. You also learned how that profession fit into the larger social hierarchy, including what tools a carpenter used and what materials he worked with. The word lists were, in a sense, miniature maps of Sumerian civilization. The educational process was fundamentally conservative. You were not learning to think creatively or to question received wisdom. You were learning to replicate, with absolute fidelity, the written heritage of your culture. This might seem stifling to you, conditioned as you are by modern educational philosophies that emphasize critical thinking and individual expression. However, in the Sumerian context, this conservatism served a vital function. Writing was power. It provided the ability to record transactions, draft contracts, and compose letters for kings. It also allowed the maintenance of administrative records that held together a complex urban society. This power had to be carefully transmitted and carefully controlled. Kramer's research revealed that as students advanced, they graduated from simple word lists to literary texts. These included myths, hymns, proverbs, and what we might call wisdom literature. One of the most copied texts in the Sumerian schools was a composition about the goddess Inanna and the god Enki. Inanna tricks Enki into giving her the divine powers known as the Me. These were the fundamental principles that governed civilization. Another frequently copied text was the story of Gilgamesh. These were individual stories that would later be woven together into the great epic. You might be familiar with its later Akkadian version. However, you need to consider something important. These literary texts were not necessarily chosen for their entertainment value. They were also not chosen for their religious content, although both aspects were certainly present. They were chosen because they were linguistically complex. They contained a wide range of vocabulary and grammatical constructions. Copying them would strengthen your command of the written language. A student might copy the story of Inanna's descent to the underworld dozens of times. Each time, he would be reinforcing his scribal skills. The role of the teacher was central. This teacher was called the Ummiyah, or expert. According to the texts Kramer studied, the Ummiyah was a figure of considerable authority. This person had completed his own training. Now, they passed on that training to the next generation. The relationship between teacher and student was formalized through a kind of apprenticeship. The student was expected to show absolute deference. The teacher, in turn, took responsibility not just for instruction, but for the student's character development. The school days text includes a section where the student's father invites the teacher to a meal. He offers the teacher gifts and praises his work. The teacher responds by blessing the student and predicting his success. This was not just social pleasantry. It was a ritual acknowledgement of the educational bond. There were also assistant teachers. These were called big brothers in the texts, though the term did not imply actual kinship. These were advanced students or recent graduates. They helped supervise the younger students, checked their work, and administered discipline. Kramer found several compositions that portrayed these big brothers. They were sometimes harsh and sometimes helpful. They occupied an ambiguous position in the school hierarchy. A student might fear a big brother's cane. However, he might also rely on his guidance when attempting a particularly difficult text. The physical environment of the Adab-Ba was austere by modern standards. Archaeological excavations of structures identified as schools have revealed modest rooms. These rooms had benches along the walls where students would sit. There were no desks in the way you might imagine them. Instead, students balanced their clay tablets on their laps or on small, portable stands. The tablets themselves were precious. This was not in terms of material value, since clay was abundant. Instead, it was due to the labor invested in them. Kramer's work emphasized that literacy in ancient Sumer was inextricably linked to this material culture of clay. He stressed that one cannot understand Sumerian learning without understanding the physical medium that made it possible. The duration of scribal training was substantial. Based on the texts and the evidence of student progression, Kramer estimated that a full scribal education might take anywhere from several years to more than 1 decade. This was an enormous investment for a family. While the student was in school, he was not working in fields. He was also not learning a craft that could immediately contribute to the household economy. The hope, of course, was that this investment would pay off. The son would graduate and secure a position in a temple administration or in the service of a wealthy patron. He would then enjoy a more comfortable and secure life than manual labor could provide. But what happened if a student could not keep up? The texts are largely silent on this question. That silence itself is telling. The preserved school compositions focus on successful students. They also focus on students who overcome their difficulties through greater effort. We do not hear about those who failed. We also do not hear about those who dropped out. We do not hear about those who proved unable or unwilling to master the demanding curriculum. Presumably, such students simply returned to other forms of work. Their abbreviated education perhaps gave them some advantage in certain contexts, but it did not qualify them for the scribal profession proper. Kramer's translations also revealed the existence of what we might call school literature. These were texts composed specifically about school life. Perhaps they were written by graduates looking back on their experiences. These texts have a peculiar quality. They are not exactly autobiographical, though they use first-person narration. They are not exactly instructional, though they certainly convey information about proper behavior and the consequences of misbehavior. They seem to occupy a middle ground. They served perhaps as both entertainment and cautionary tale. Students could read them and simultaneously recognize their own experiences and learn from the formalized examples. One of the most striking aspects of these texts is their focus on the mundane details of daily life. They describe the lunch the mother prepares, the route walked to school, the specific teachers encountered, and the particular mistakes made. This attention to the ordinary, Kramer argued, reflects something fundamental about Sumerian literary culture. It shows an interest in recording not just grand events and divine actions, but also the textures of everyday experience. In these school texts, one can see the beginnings of a kind of realism. This was a willingness to portray life as it was actually lived, with all its tedium and small frustrations. Yet beneath this realism, there is also an ideological project at work. The school texts consistently present scribal education as difficult but worthwhile. Discipline is harsh but necessary, and teachers are strict but ultimately benevolent. They reinforce the value of literacy, the importance of the scribal tradition, and the legitimacy of the educational hierarchy. A student who copied these texts was not just practicing his writing, he was also internalizing a set of values. This meant accepting a particular vision of how society should be organized and understanding where he might fit within it. As one stands in that street in Nippur, listening to the chanting voices, one might wonder what those students were actually saying. The repetition suggests memorization and the recitation of something learned by heart. Perhaps they were chanting one of the word lists, such as the names of trees or stones. Their voices would blend together so that individual words became indistinguishable. Perhaps they were practicing a mathematical table. Mathematics was part of the curriculum too, though that is a subject for later consideration. Or perhaps they were reciting a hymn to Enlil, the chief god of Nippur, combining their scribal practice with religious devotion. The Dub Ba-Ya existed in a specific urban context. Nippur was a religious center, home to Enlil's great temple. The schools there trained scribes who would serve that temple and its extensive administrative apparatus. Schools existed in other cities too, including Ur, Uruk, Larsa, and Babylon. Each had its own character, influenced by local traditions and the particular institutions it served. Kramer's research drew on texts from multiple sites. This allowed him to construct a composite picture of Sumerian education, while also noting regional variations. But here is a question that the evidence does not quite answer. A puzzle that Kramer acknowledged in his work. How standardized was this education? The curriculum seems remarkably consistent across different cities and different time periods. The same sign lists appear in Nippur and Ur, separated by many miles and sometimes by generations. The same literary texts were copied in multiple locations. This suggests a degree of coordination, a shared understanding of what scribal education should entail. Yet, who maintained this standardization? Was there some central authority that dictated curriculum? Or was the consistency maintained more organically, through the movement of scribes from city to city, and through the transmission of traditions from teacher to student? This question matters because it touches on something fundamental. It shows how knowledge systems perpetuate themselves and how cultural practices remain stable. This occurs even in the absence of formal institutions to enforce that stability. The Sumerian scribal tradition survived for centuries. Its basic methods and texts changed only gradually. However, the mechanism of that survival and the social and cultural forces that sustained it remain partially mysterious. One can see the results, for example, the thousands of school tablets excavated from ancient sites. The literary texts were preserved across multiple copies. Yet the process that produced those results is harder to grasp. As the sun climbs higher and the street grows warmer, the voices from the Dub Ba continue their rhythmic chanting. Inside that unremarkable building, boys are being transformed into scribes. They are becoming the keepers of their civilization's written memory. They are learning a skill that will define their lives. This skill will separate them from the vast majority of their fellow citizens. It will give them access to knowledge and power most people never touch. However, they are also being shaped by that learning. Their minds are molded to think in certain ways, to value certain things, and to see the world through the particular lens of Sumerian literate culture. And yet, for all the detail preserved in the tablets Kramer studied, there is something that remains just out of reach. This applies to all the specificity of the school days text, the sign lists, and the literary compositions. What did it actually feel like to be a student in the Idub Ba'a? What was it like to wake before dawn, day after day? Imagine knowing that a beating might await one for even small mistakes. What did one think about as one pressed the stylus into clay for the 100th time? One formed the same signs over and over. Did one ever pause in copying a myth or hymn and actually think about what the words meant? Did one consider the stories they told? Or did the content become secondary to the form, with the meaning less important than the correct execution of the signs? These questions do not have clear answers in the archaeological record. The texts give us behaviors and rituals, structures, and content. However, the interior experience of ancient students remains largely opaque. Kramer was careful to distinguish between what the evidence clearly showed and what could only be inferred or imagined. He presented Sumerian education as a system with its own logic and its own purposes. This was done without imposing modern judgments about whether that system was good or bad, effective or ineffective. His goal was understanding, not evaluation. Still, one might find oneself wondering, as one listens to those distant voices, whether some of those students loved their studies. One might also wonder whether all of them found it burdensome. Were there boys who delighted in the feel of the stylus in their hands? Did they take pride in forming each sign perfectly? Did they eagerly absorb the myths and hymns they copied? Or was it all discipline and duty, sustained only by the promise of future security? The preserved texts emphasize the difficult aspects of school life. However, that might be a literary convention rather than a complete picture. Perhaps the complaints and the beatings were memorable precisely because they contrasted with longer stretches of satisfying work and gradual mastery. What seems clear is that the Sumerian scribal school was the crucible in which a particular kind of person was forged. This was someone who could read and write. This person also internalized a vast amount of cultural knowledge. They understood the proper forms for different kinds of texts. They could navigate the bureaucratic and religious institutions that dominated Sumerian society. The Edub-Ba did not just teach technical skills, it also socialized its students into an elite class with shared knowledge and shared values. And that class was small. Kramer estimated that literacy rates in ancient Sumer were probably well under 5%, possibly as low as 1 or 2%. The scribes formed a tiny minority, yet they wielded influence far beyond their numbers because they controlled written communication. Every contract, every legal dispute, every royal decree, and every temple offering required someone who could write and someone who could read. The scribes did not rule. That was the role of kings and priests. However, rulership depended on scribal expertise. As one stands in that street, the question that emerges is not just what these students were learning. It also concerns why this particular form of learning developed in Sumer and not elsewhere. Furthermore, it asks why this occurred at this particular time and not earlier or later. What conditions made the Edub-Ba'a possible or even necessary? That question leads deeper into Sumerian society. It explores the structures that underpinned their civilization and the beliefs that gave those structures meaning. The school was not an isolated institution. It was part of a larger system, a web of relationships between gods and humans, between rulers and ruled, and between the written word and the lived world. But before exploring those larger questions, it is worth lingering a moment longer on the physicality of this educational process. Consider the sheer material effort it required. For instance, consider the preparation of clay tablets alone. Someone had to dig the clay, transport it, mix it with water to the proper consistency, and form it into tablets of varying sizes. This varied depending on the text to be inscribed. Someone also had to cut and prepare the reed styluses, replacing them when they wore down or broke. Someone had to provide lighting for students working in windowless rooms or during dark winter mornings. The mundane logistics of maintaining a school were considerable. They required economic support from families and perhaps from temple institutions. The clay tablets themselves accumulated rapidly. A single student might produce dozens or even hundreds of practice tablets over the course of years. What happened to all these tablets? Some were recycled. The clay was moistened and reformed for new use. Some were discarded in ancient trash heaps, where modern archaeologists would eventually find them. Some, particularly the tablets containing important literary texts or exemplary calligraphy, were preserved in school archives. The physical residue of Sumerian education is staggering. Tens of thousands of school tablets have been excavated. Presumably many more remain buried or were destroyed in antiquity. This accumulation of clay, of pressed marks representing sounds, words, and ideas, constituted a material archive unlike anything that had existed before. Oral traditions, songs, and stories were passed down through memory. Craft traditions and techniques were preserved through apprenticeship and demonstration. However, the written archive was different. It was more permanent, more transportable, and more independent of any individual memory. A tablet could be stored for decades and then read by someone who had never met the scribe who wrote it. Knowledge could accumulate across generations in a much more systematic way. And yet this written archive was also fragile in its own ways. Clay tablets could break. They could be destroyed in fires or floods. The knowledge they preserved depended on continuing traditions of literacy. If no one could read cuneiform anymore, the tablets became meaningless objects. This actually happened, of course. Cuneiform literacy eventually died out. For centuries, the tablets were curiosities at best, their writing unreadable. Only in the 19th century, through the painstaking work of scholars like Kramer, did the Sumerian texts begin to speak again. This revealed a civilization that had been silent for millennia. So when one hears those voices chanting in the Edub Ba'a, one is hearing a sound that connected ancient students to a tradition. This tradition stretched backward in time, and they hoped it would stretch forward indefinitely. They could not have known that their script would eventually be forgotten. They could not have known that their language would become a scholarly puzzle. They learned to write believing that writing was permanent. They believed that what was inscribed in clay was preserved forever. In a sense, they were right. The tablets did survive. However, they could not have imagined the gulf of time that would separate their world from ours. They also could not have imagined how difficult it would be for future generations to bridge that gulf. The question remains in the warm morning air. What did these students think they were learning this all for? This is not just in the practical sense, to get a job or to please their parents. It is also in a deeper sense. Did they understand themselves as preserving and transmitting something sacred? Did the myths and hymns they copied carry real religious significance for them? Or were they just texts to be mastered? How did their education shape what they knew? How did it shape the very structures of their minds and imaginations? Stepping through the doorway of the Edub Ba'a, you enter a dim interior space. It smells of wet clay and the faint smokiness of oil lamps. Your eyes adjust slowly to the reduced light. The room is larger than you expected from outside. Benches are arranged in rows along the walls. Some benches are occupied by students bent over their work. Others sit empty, waiting for the next group. The chanting you heard from the street has stopped. It is replaced by a quieter murmur of individual effort. You hear the soft sound of styluses pressing into clay. There is an occasional whispered consultation between students. You also hear the rustle of movement as someone shifts position or reaches for a new tablet. At the far end of the room sits the Ummiyah, the master teacher. He is an older man whose face is weathered and whose fingers are stained with clay. He is not actively teaching at this moment. Instead, he observes, his gaze moving slowly across the room. He takes in each student's work. Beside him stands a senior student, perhaps in his late teens or early 20s. This student walks between the benches, pausing here and there. He examines a student's tablet, sometimes nodding approval, sometimes pointing out an error. Kramer's research emphasized that observation and correction were central to the Sumerian pedagogical method. There were no lectures in the modern sense. There were no presentations of new material. Instead, the teacher provided models such as a perfectly executed sign list or a beautifully written literary text. The students then attempted to replicate those models. Learning was understood as a process of imitation. This process gradually perfected through repetition and correction. The teacher's role was to maintain standards. This prevented the degradation of the scribal tradition through carelessness or innovation. You notice that the students are not all the same age. Some are quite young, perhaps 8 or 9 years old. Their small hands struggle to control the stylus. Others are older teenagers. Their work is more assured, and their tablets contain more complex texts. This mixed-age environment was typical, according to the evidence Kramer assembled. Students advanced at their own pace. They moved through the curriculum as they demonstrated mastery of each level. There was no concept of graduating all together as a single class, nor were students held back because their age group was moving on. You progressed individually. Your position in the school hierarchy was determined by your skill level rather than your chronological age. One of the younger students is working on a simple sign list. His tablet shows the basic wedge shapes repeated in wobbly rows. His tongue is visible between his lips, a sign of his intense concentration. Every few moments, he glances toward the older students. He tries to see what they are doing. Perhaps he imagines himself at that level someday. The senior student approaches him. He examines the tablet and says something you cannot quite hear. The boy's face falls slightly. He then begins carefully smoothing out one section of his tablet to redo it. Across the room, an older student is copying a literary text. You can tell this by the way the signs flow in longer lines. There is also an absence of the rigid columnar format found in word lists. This student seems absorbed in his work. His stylus moves with confidence. He has reached the stage where the physical act of writing has become automatic. His attention can shift to the meaning of the text. He no longer focuses just on the formation of individual signs. Kramer noted that this transition, from mechanical copying to understanding, was crucial. However, it was difficult to document precisely. At what point did a student stop simply replicating signs? When did they start actually reading, comprehending the words as words rather than as shapes to be reproduced? The literary text this student is copying is a section of a hymn to the goddess Nisaba. You recognize it from your knowledge of Kramer's translations. Nisaba was the patron deity of scribes and of grain. This combination made perfect sense in a culture where record-keeping first developed. It helped to track agricultural surplus. The hymn praises Nisaba's wisdom. It highlights her role in establishing the scribal arts. It also connects her to everything written and measured. For the student copying this hymn, the act of writing is simultaneously a religious devotion, a technical exercise, and an assertion of professional identity. He is placing himself in a lineage that stretches back to the gods themselves. However, even as the student copies these devotional words, you wonder how much he actually believes. Does he see Nisaba as a real, active presence in his life? Kramer's work on Sumerian religion suggested that the relationship between formal religious ideology and personal belief was complex. This is a topic we will explore more fully later. The official texts spoke as if the gods' reality and power were absolute and unquestioned. But what did individuals actually think? The evidence is scarce. People did not write down their doubts or their private theological speculations, at least not in forms that survived. What we have are the official texts. These are the formal expressions of belief. We can only guess at what interior landscape of faith or skepticism lay behind the correct performance of religious formulae. The Ummiyah rises from his seat and walks slowly down the center of the room. Students straighten slightly as he passes, though they do not stop their work. He pauses behind one student and speaks quietly, offering what seems to be a word of praise or encouragement. The student's face brightens noticeably. He moves on to another student, and this time his voice is sharper. The student's shoulders tense, and he begins working with renewed urgency. This pattern of variable response was essential to maintaining motivation and discipline. It involved praise for some and correction or rebuke for others. This is according to the school texts Kramer studied. The teacher had to balance encouragement with demands. He had to push students to improve while not crushing their confidence entirely. It was a delicate equilibrium. The texts suggest it was not always successfully maintained. Some students clearly thrived in this environment. Others struggled psychologically as well as academically. The school days text that Kramer translated includes a fascinating section. In it, the student, after a particularly bad day of repeated beatings, comes home. He complains to his father. The father's response is to invite the teacher to dinner. He then showers the teacher with gifts, such as fine clothes, a ring, and oil. This transaction might seem like bribery to modern sensibilities. However, it was understood differently in the Sumerian context. It was a ritual acknowledgement of the teacher's authority and importance. It was a way of honoring the educational relationship. Perhaps it also ensured more favorable treatment for the son. The text suggests this strategy worked. After the dinner, the teacher blesses the student lavishly and predicts his future success. What is striking about this episode is what it reveals about the social dynamics surrounding education. The father clearly has the economic resources to host a feast. He can also provide expensive gifts. This confirms that scribal education was the province of wealthier families. However, the father does not use his economic power to challenge the teacher's authority. He also does not demand better treatment for his son. Instead, he reinforces the teacher's position. This validates the disciplinary regime even as he seeks to mitigate its impact on his child. The hierarchy is maintained, even as individual relationships within that hierarchy are negotiated. You move closer to examine one of the tablets sitting on a bench. It is a practice piece. It shows the same line of text written multiple times with varying degrees of success. The first line is careful but crude. The signs are large and somewhat malformed. The second line shows improvement. The signs are smaller and more uniform. By the fourth or fifth repetition, the student has achieved something close to the standard form. This progression from error to correctness encapsulates the Sumerian educational philosophy. It highlights perfection through persistent practice. But look more closely at the tablet. Look at the actual clay surface. You can see the marks of previous attempts. These were partially smoothed away. You can see the ghostly traces of earlier efforts. The tablet is a palimpsest. It is a surface that has been written on, erased, and written on again. This reuse of material was practical. Clay was abundant, but preparing tablets was labor-intensive. It also has a metaphorical resonance. The student's mind was like the tablet. It was written on repeatedly until the correct forms were permanently impressed. Error was smoothed away. Only proper knowledge remained. Kramer noted that Sumerian educational texts sometimes used the metaphor of softening and hardening. This described the learning process. The student's mind was like clay. It was soft and shapeable when young. It gradually hardened into permanence as education progressed. Once you had been properly trained, once your education was complete, your knowledge was set. It was permanent, like a fired tablet that could no longer be altered. This metaphor suggested both the possibility of shaping young minds and the difficulty of changing them once they had matured. The tablet you are examining contains an error that was not corrected. It is a sign that is recognizable but definitely malformed. Why was this not fixed? Perhaps the student simply did not notice. He may have been working too quickly or too carelessly. Or perhaps he did notice, but he decided it was close enough. This might be acceptable for a practice piece, even if it would not pass in a formal context. This raises the question of what standards students actually internalized. It also raises the question of what standards they aspired to when being observed. Was there a private level of effort distinct from the public performance of competence? A sudden commotion draws your attention to the far corner of the room. One of the younger students has knocked over a container of water. This water was used for moistening clay. Several tablets are getting wet. The senior student rushes over, his face showing frustration. He begins issuing rapid instructions. Other students hurry to move their work to safety. The boy who caused the accident looks terrified. He clearly expects punishment, but the Ummiyah, who has also noticed the disruption, simply watches calmly. After the situation is resolved and the floor is wiped clean, he calls the boy over. He speaks to him privately. You cannot hear what is said. However, the boy nods repeatedly and then returns to his place. His expression is relieved rather than fearful. This incident, minor as it is, illustrates something important about the Sumerian school. The surviving texts do not always make it clear. Accidents happened. Responses to them varied. The literary texts emphasize harsh discipline. They highlight beatings for infractions, but daily life was presumably more nuanced. Not every mistake resulted in punishment. Not every teacher was equally severe. The texts present an idealized or perhaps dramatized version of school life. This is useful for literary purposes. However, it is not necessarily a complete representation of reality. As the disruption settles, the room returns to its working quiet. You become aware of the passage of time. How long have these students been working? The light filtering through the doorway has shifted slightly. This suggests hours have passed. Although there was no dramatic change, Kramer's analysis of the school day's text suggested that the school day was long. It began early and extended well into the afternoon. Students might get a break for lunch. The text mentions the student eating the 2 rolls his mother prepared. Otherwise, the day was devoted to continuous practice and study. This duration raised physical questions. How did young children maintain concentration for such extended periods? The text suggests they did not always succeed. It mentions the student speaking when he should not, standing up without permission, and leaving the school grounds. These infractions might be read as violations of discipline. However, they might also simply be the natural fidgeting and restlessness of children. These children were confined indoors for hours, forced to repeat tedious exercises endlessly. The Sumerian educational system demanded a level of patience and self-control. This must have been extremely challenging for many students, particularly the younger ones. Yet they persisted day after day, year after year. What sustained them? Fear of punishment was certainly part of it. The hope of future security and status was another element. However, there might also have been the satisfaction of gradual mastery. Students found pleasure in seeing their own improvement as their signs became cleaner and their tablets more accomplished. Humans are capable of finding satisfaction in skill development. This is true even for skills that are difficult and demanding. Perhaps some of these students experienced a genuine sense of pride in their work. This was a craftsman's pleasure in doing something well. The older student who was copying the hymn to Nisaba had finished his tablet. He was now letting it dry. He sat back, flexing his fingers. After hours of gripping the stylus, his hand must have been cramped and sore. Scribal work was physically demanding in ways we might not immediately recognize. The repetitive motion of pressing the stylus into clay, maintained for hours, would cause muscle fatigue. It also caused potential chronic pain in the hands and wrists. Some scholars suggested that older scribes might have suffered from what we would call repetitive strain injuries. However, the ancient texts do not explicitly discuss such ailments. The student who had just finished looked at his work. His expression was difficult to read. Was it satisfaction, relief, or critical assessment? He seemed about to reach for another tablet. Then the Ummiyah clapped his hands loudly. This was a signal you recognized as marking a transition. The students stopped their work. Those who were standing returned to their places. The atmosphere in the room shifted from individual concentration to collective attention. The Ummiyah began to speak. You realized this was one of the rare moments of direct verbal instruction. It was not observation and correction. His voice was strong, carrying easily through the room. The students listened with apparent attentiveness. He was reciting a proverb or perhaps a wisdom saying. You recognized this from the rhythmic quality of his speech. The students listened. Then, at some invisible signal, they began to repeat his words in unison. Their voices blended together in the same kind of chant you had heard from outside earlier. This was another dimension of Sumerian education that Kramer's research illuminated. It was the extensive use of proverbs and wisdom literature. These short sayings were collected in vast lists. They served multiple purposes. They provided moral instruction, teaching proper behavior and attitudes. They offered practical advice about navigating social relationships. Additionally, they transmitted cultural values. They reinforced what it meant to be a good Sumerian, a good son, and a good scribe. Students memorized hundreds of these proverbs. They internalized not just the words, but also the worldview they encoded. The proverb the class was now reciting was something Kramer would have recognized. It stated that scribal art was the mother of speakers and the father of scholars. The exact translation might vary. However, the sentiment was clear. Literacy was foundational, the source from which eloquence and wisdom flowed. By repeating this proverb, the students were affirming their chosen path. They were asserting the value of what they were doing and justifying the hardship of their training. The proverb was both descriptive and prescriptive. It stated what literacy was and what it should be valued as. After the collective recitation, the Ummiyah nodded. The students returned to their individual work. However, something had shifted. The brief moment of shared activity and collective voice had created a sense of group identity. This sense of identity was not present before. These students were not just individuals struggling through their lessons in isolation. They were members of a community. They were bound together by shared experiences, shared knowledge, and shared suffering, perhaps. The Edub Ba'a was creating not just literate individuals. It was also creating a class, a cohort of people. These people would recognize each other as fellow initiates into the scribal mysteries throughout their lives. Kramer observed in his writings that Sumerian culture placed great emphasis on collegiality among scribes. The texts referred to scribal brothers. These were networks of professional relationships that extended across cities and generations. A scribe trained in Nippur might travel to Ur. There, he would find welcome among the scribes. This was because they shared a common education, common texts, and common values. This professional solidarity was fostered in the Edub Ba'e. There, students learned not just technical skills. They also learned a sense of belonging to something larger than themselves. You noticed that one of the middle-aged students had produced a tablet. This tablet caught the light in a particular way. Moving closer, you saw that his signs were exceptionally well formed. Each wedge was crisp and precisely angled. This was the work of someone who had moved beyond mere competence. It was approaching artistry. Even in the utilitarian task of copying a word list, there was an aesthetic dimension. Signs could be functional, but ugly. They could also be functional and beautiful. The best scribes achieved both. Their work was presumably valued not just for its content, but also for its form. This aesthetic element of scribal work was something modern readers might overlook. People thought of Cuneiform as simply a writing system. It was a technology for recording language. However, for the Sumerians, beautiful writing was an art form. Accomplished scribes took pride in their calligraphy. Tablets from temple archives or royal collections often displayed exceptionally fine writing. This suggested that appearance mattered. It also suggested that the visual impact of the text was part of its meaning and authority. Students in the Edub Ba were not just learning to write legibly. They were learning to write beautifully. However, beauty took time. Time was a luxury in contexts where writing served primarily practical purposes. A scribe recording grain deliveries or tax payments could not spend hours perfecting each sign. He needed to write quickly and legibly. This produced functional tablets that communicated necessary information. He did this without wasting effort on refinement. Therefore, scribal training had to balance two somewhat contradictory demands. These were the demand for aesthetic excellence and the demand for practical efficiency. Students needed to be able to write beautifully when circumstances required it. They also needed to write quickly when speed was essential. The Ummiyah was now walking through the room again. This time he was carrying something. It was a tablet that was clearly older. Clay was darker and harder than the fresh practice tablets the students were using. He stopped in the center of the room. He held it up so all could see. His voice took on a different quality. It was more formal, almost ceremonial. He explained that this tablet contained a composition by a famous scribe from several generations past. This was a model of excellence that students should aspire to emulate. He began to read from the tablet. The students put down their own work to listen. The reading was slow and deliberate. There was attention to the rhythm and sound of the Sumerian language, as well as to meaning. This was a reminder that literacy in ancient Sumer was not silent. Unlike modern reading, which is typically a private visual activity conducted in silence, Sumerian literacy was intimately connected to sound. It was connected to the voice. Texts were meant to be read aloud. Learning to read meant learning to perform texts orally. It also meant understanding them visually. The composition the Ummiyah was reading was a hymn. It was addressed to the moon god Nana. It praised the god's beauty, his power, and his role in maintaining cosmic order. The language was elevated and poetic. It was full of imagery and epithets. This was literature in the fullest sense. It was not just functional writing, but an artful use of language designed to move and persuade. The students listened with varying degrees of attention. Some seemed genuinely engaged. Their faces reflected concentration and perhaps even appreciation. Others looked dutiful, but somewhat blank. They were going through the motions of listening without deep engagement. When the Ummiyah finished reading, he asked questions. He wanted to know if anyone could identify a particular obscure word. He also asked if anyone could explain a grammatical construction. Finally, he asked if anyone could discuss the significance of a certain metaphor. A few hands rose tentatively. One of the older students ventured an answer. The Umayyad nodded approvingly. He then elaborated and expanded on what the student said. Another question received a less satisfactory response. The Umayyad patiently corrected the misunderstanding. He re-explained a concept the student had confused. This interactive element, questioning and discussion, was apparently part of advanced scribal education. However, Kramer noted it was less thoroughly documented in the surviving texts than the copying exercises. The texts we have are mostly physical artifacts. These were the tablets students produced. They naturally emphasized written work. However, education surely also involved oral instruction, dialogue, and explanation. The Umayyad's knowledge could not be fully transmitted through models and corrections alone. There had to be moments when he simply told students things. He explained contexts and meanings that were not self-evident from the texts themselves. Consider what it meant to understand a Sumerian literary text. You had to know the language, of course. This included the vocabulary and grammar. However, you also needed cultural context. You needed to know who Nana was. You also needed to know what cities worshipped him. Furthermore, you needed to know what myths involved him and what his symbolic associations were. You needed to understand the conventions of hymnic literature. This included the stock phrases and epithets that appeared repeatedly. You needed to recognize allusions to other texts. These were intertextual connections that enriched meaning for knowledgeable readers. All of this contextual knowledge could not be derived from the texts alone. It had to be supplied by teaching, by explanation, and by immersion in the living culture that produced the texts. However, this was where Kramer's position in history became relevant. He was reading these texts millennia after they were written. This was in a world where the living context had been lost. He had to reconstruct that context painstakingly. This involved comparing texts, consulting later commentaries, drawing on archaeological evidence, and making educated guesses. His understanding of Sumerian literature and education was necessarily partial. It was filtered through the limitations of the evidence and his own cultural assumptions. When he described what happened in the Edab Ba'a, he was offering his best interpretation of fragmentary sources. This was not a perfect, transparent window into the past. This epistemological humility is important to maintain as you stand in this reconstructed schoolroom. What you are seeing is a historically informed imagination. It is a careful attempt to visualize Sumerian education based on textual and archaeological evidence. However, it is not identical to what actually happened. The real Edab Ba'a in ancient Nippur undoubtedly contained elements and dynamics. These left no trace in the record. They cannot be recovered no matter how carefully we study the surviving tablets. The Umayyad has returned to his seat. The students have resumed their individual work. The afternoon is advancing. You can tell this from the quality of light. It is now somewhat softer and more golden than the harsh morning brightness. Some students look tired. Their concentration is visibly flagging. One of the younger boys has his head down on the bench. He is perhaps sleeping or perhaps just resting his eyes. The big brother notices and approaches. He taps the boy's shoulder, not harshly but firmly. The boy sits up, startled. He returns to his work with obvious effort. How much longer will the school day continue? The texts are not entirely clear on this point. It seems likely that students were released when the light began to fail. Working by lamplight was possible. However, it was less efficient and more expensive. So the day's natural rhythm was tied to the sun. It began shortly after dawn and ended in the late afternoon. This gave students a substantial amount of working time. It also meant that education was essentially suspended during the longer winter evenings. This was unless wealthy schools could afford extensive lamp oil. You watch as one student carefully lifts his tablet. It is now dry enough to be stable. He carries it to a shelf along one wall where other finished tablets are stored. This archive of student work represents an enormous investment of effort. Each tablet was the product of time and concentration. Each one marked a small step in the long journey toward scribal mastery. Some of these tablets would be kept as exemplars, models for future students. Others would eventually be resold. Their clay was returned to the preparation area to be reformed into new tablets. The archive was living, constantly growing and contracting. It served as a physical record of the school's ongoing work. Kramer's excavations and studies revealed that some Sumerian schools maintained quite extensive archives. These included not just student work, but also reference materials. Such materials included sign lists, word lists, literary texts, and mathematical tables. These reference collections made the Edub Baer more than just a place of instruction. They were also repositories of knowledge. They served as proto-libraries where information was stored and made available for consultation. An advanced student or a practicing scribe might return to the school. They could consult a rare text. They could also check a particular sign form against the authoritative versions kept in the archive. This archival function connected the schools to the broader knowledge economy of Sumerian civilization. The temples had their own archives. These contained vast collections of administrative records, religious texts, and literary works. The palace also had archives containing royal correspondence, law codes, and treaties. Private scribes maintained personal collections of the texts they used most frequently. However, the school archives were unique in their pedagogical purpose. They existed not primarily to preserve information for administrative or religious use. Instead, their goal was to transmit knowledge across generations. They aimed to turn that accumulated written heritage into the living skill of new scribes. The thought of generational transmission brings you back to the Ummiyah. He is still sitting and observing his students. He was once a student himself. He sat on these same benches or benches very like them. He struggled through the same sign lists. He copied the same literary texts. His own education, completed perhaps decades ago, qualified him to now transmit that education to others. Among his current students, one or more might eventually become teachers themselves. This would continue the chain of transmission indefinitely into the future. However, this chain was never automatic or guaranteed. It required constant effort and constant renewal. In each generation, enough students had to successfully complete their training. Enough of those graduates had to decide to become teachers rather than pursuing other scribal careers. The economic conditions had to remain stable enough that families could afford to send their sons to school. The social value of literacy had to be maintained. This ensured that scribal positions remained prestigious and rewarding. Any break in this chain could threaten the entire system. This included a generation of unsuccessful students, a collapse of the economy, or a shift in cultural values. Kramer lived through and studied a time when such a break had actually occurred. Cuneiform literacy did not end suddenly. Instead, it did eventually fade away. By the early centuries of the Common Era, fewer and fewer people could read the ancient scripts. The last datable cuneiform text is from the 1st century of the Common Era. This was nearly 2,000 years after the Sumerian schools Kramer studied. After that, the knowledge was lost. It was preserved only in the silent tablets buried in ancient ruins. What caused this decline? The question is complex. It involved the rise of alphabetic writing systems that were easier to learn. It also involved the spread of Aramaic as a common language. Political upheavals disrupted traditional institutions. Other factors, which we can only guess at, also contributed. However, the result was that the chain of transmission broke. The Edab-Ba'a closed its doors for the last time. The Ummiyas died without successors. The tablets became artifacts. They waited patiently in the earth for a future. This future was when someone would painstakingly reconstruct the lost knowledge. Then, they would make the texts speak again. You realize that your presence here depends entirely on scholars like Kramer. Your ability to imagine this scene with any accuracy also depends on them. These scholars devoted their lives to rebuilding that broken chain. They could not restore the living tradition. Cuneiform remains a dead script. Sumerian is a dead language. However, they could recover the knowledge. They could read the texts again. They could tell us what the Sumerians thought, believed, and taught. In doing so, they performed an educational work. This work was not so different from what the Ummiyah was doing. They transmitted knowledge across a gulf of incomprehension. They made the incomprehensible comprehensible through patient explanation and instruction. The light is definitely fading now. The Ummiyah claps his hands once more. This time the sound signals the end of the day. Students set down their styluses with visible relief. Some stretch, working out the stiffness from hours of sitting. Others carefully gather their materials, preparing to take certain tablets home. The big brother moves through the room. He collects tablets that will be stored in the school archive. He makes sure everything is properly organized for tomorrow. As the students file out, they pass through the doorway into the street. You can hear them beginning to talk among themselves. Their voices rise in volume and energy. This is because the enforced quiet of the school day is over. They are just boys again, not scribes in training. They are children released from duty. They are heading home to families and meals. They anticipate the brief freedom of evening before the cycle begins again tomorrow. However, what they carry with them, invisibly, is the day's accumulation of knowledge. This includes new signs mastered, new texts partially memorized, and new corrections internalized. The physical tablets remain in the school. However, the mental impressions go with the students. Over time, those mental impressions will become permanent. They will harden into expertise. They will transform these boys into scribes who carry forward the Sumerian written tradition. The Ummiyah remains behind, alone now, except for the big brother who is tidying the room. He sits quietly. You wonder what he is thinking. Is he satisfied with the day's work? Is he frustrated with particular students who are not progressing as they should? Is he tired from the effort of maintaining attention and authority for hours? Or is he perhaps thinking beyond the immediate concerns of daily teaching? He may be considering larger questions about knowledge and its transmission. He might be contemplating what it means to be a link in a chain. This chain stretches back to the earliest scribes and forward to an unknown future. These questions do not have answers you can verify. The Ummiyah's interior life, like that of his students, is inaccessible to us. We have behaviors and texts, rituals and artifacts. However, the lived experience behind them remains mysterious. Kramer understood this limitation. He could tell us what Sumerians did and what they wrote. However, he was appropriately cautious. He did not claim to know what they felt or thought in any deep, personal sense. As darkness settles, the Ummiyah finally rises to leave. The Edab-Ba'a empties and falls silent. You are left with an image of education as a fundamentally hopeful act. To teach is to believe in the future. It is to invest effort in shaping minds that will outlive you. The Sumerians could not have known that their civilization would fall. They could not have known that their language would be forgotten. They also could not have known that their carefully maintained scribal tradition would eventually break. They taught as if it would continue forever. In doing so, They preserved enough that we can, millennia later, reconstruct their world. We can also learn from their example. You are holding a clay tablet in your hands. This small rectangular object fits comfortably in your palm. The surface is covered with cuneiform signs. However, these are not the literary texts or word lists you saw students copying in the Edub Ba'ar. These signs are different. They are more systematic and more abstract. They are numbers. This tablet is a mathematical text. What it reveals about Sumerian learning extends far beyond simple arithmetic. Samuel Noah Kramer devoted considerable attention to Sumerian mathematics in his research. He recognized that the way a culture organizes and teaches numerical thinking tells us something profound. This reveals how that culture understands order, measurement, and reality itself. The Sumerian number system was sexagesimal, meaning it was based on 60 rather than the decimal system of 10 that you are accustomed to. This might seem arbitrary at first. However, there were practical reasons for this choice. These become clear when you consider what the Sumerians were actually trying to accomplish with numbers. 60 is a highly composite number. This means it can be divided evenly by many other numbers. For example, it can be divided by 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. It can also be divided by 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. This made it exceptionally useful for the kinds of calculations Sumerians needed to perform regularly. These included dividing goods among people, measuring fields and calculating areas, distributing rations, and tracking time. The tablet you are holding contains what Kramer would have identified as a multiplication table. However, it is not quite like the multiplication tables you might remember from your own education. This is a table of reciprocals and multiples. It was designed to facilitate division through multiplication. The Sumerian approach to division was to multiply by the reciprocal. For example, instead of dividing by 5, you would multiply by 12. This is because 12 is the reciprocal of 5 in a base 60 system. 5 times 12 equals 60. This might seem more complicated than direct division. However, in practice it made calculations more systematic. It also made them less prone to error once you had memorized the necessary reciprocal pairs. Students in the Ada Baba spent considerable time memorizing these mathematical tables. Just as they memorized sign lists and word lists, they also memorized number lists. These included multiplication tables, reciprocal tables, and tables of squares and square roots. They also memorized tables of cubes and cube roots. Kramer's research uncovered numerous practice tablets. These tablets showed students working through numerical exercises. Students made errors and then corrected them. They gradually internalized mathematical relationships. These relationships would be essential for their future work as scribes. Why did scribes need mathematics? The answer lies in the fundamentally administrative nature of Sumerian civilization. The cities of Sumer were managed through extensive bureaucratic systems. These systems tracked everything. This included grain harvests, distributions, livestock counts, and labor obligations. They also tracked canal maintenance, trade goods, and temple offerings. All of this required calculation. A scribe working in a temple administration needed to calculate grain quantities. For example, they calculated how much grain was required to feed a specific workforce. This involved accounting for a certain number of days. A scribe working for a merchant might need to calculate the total value of mixed goods. This involved converting between different measures and standards. A scribe working on a building project might calculate the volume of earth to be moved. They also determined the number of bricks required. This was for a wall of specified dimensions. These were not abstract mathematical puzzles pursued for intellectual pleasure. They were practical problems with real consequences. Errors in calculation could mean workers went hungry, building projects could run short of materials, trade disputes might arise from incorrect values. The Ida provided mathematical training. This training produced scribes who could perform calculations reliably, quickly, and accurately. This ensured the complex administrative machinery of Sumerian society functioned smoothly. Kramer noted that Sumerian mathematical texts showed remarkable sophistication. They were not limited to simple arithmetic. There were problems involving geometric progressions. Other problems required what we would call algebraic thinking. However, they did not use algebraic notation. There were also complex area and volume calculations. One famous problem text was studied extensively by Kramer. It presented a series of increasingly difficult scenarios. For example, fields of irregular shape needed to be measured, mixtures of different grain types needed to be valued. Irrigation projects required calculating water flow and distribution. These problem texts served a pedagogical function. They were graduated exercises, arranged from simpler to more complex. They were designed to build student competence systematically, but they also served as demonstrations of scribal expertise. A scribe who could solve these problems demonstrated mastery of a valuable skill set. They showed their working and arrived at correct answers. The problems themselves reflected the actual challenges scribes faced. They included specific scenarios and numbers from professional work. Look more closely at the tablet in your hands. The numerical notation itself is elegant in its simplicity. Small vertical wedges represent units from 1 through 9. Larger wedge shapes represent tens. A special symbol represents 60, the base of the system. This symbol was either a larger wedge or sometimes a combination of wedges. Larger numbers are expressed through this positional notation. For example, a sign meaning 2 followed by a sign meaning 30 would represent 150. This is calculated as 2 times 60 plus 30. This positional system was a significant mathematical innovation. The value of a sign depended on its position in a number. It made representing large numbers much more efficient than systems that required unique symbols for each power of 10. However, the positional system also introduced ambiguity. Without a 0 or a decimal point, context was essential. A number might mean 5, or 300, or 18,000. For example, 300 meant 5 times 60. 18,000 meant 5 times 60 times 60. Experienced scribes learned to read these numbers correctly. They used contextual clues and standardized formats. These formats made the intended magnitude clear. But for students, this ambiguity was undoubtedly a source of confusion and error. Practice tablets show students struggling with place value. They made mistakes suggesting they had not fully internalized the system's positional logic. Kramer observed that the Sumerians developed their mathematical notation and methods over centuries through practical experience. The earliest numerical records from Sumer date to the late 4th millennium before Common Era. They used a simpler system. This system had distinct symbols for different quantities and kinds of goods. A certain symbol meant 1 jar of oil. A different symbol meant 1 sheep. Another meant 1 measure of grain. These were not yet abstract numbers that could be applied to anything. They were counting specific objects. Over time, this concrete notation evolved. It became the more abstract system you are looking at now. Numbers existed independently of the objects being counted. This abstraction was a crucial cognitive shift. It required understanding that 5 was a concept. It could apply equally to 5 sheep, 5 jars of oil, 5 days, or 5 anything. This might seem obvious to you. You were raised in a culture where abstract number concepts are taught from early childhood. However, it was actually a significant intellectual achievement. It took generations to develop and standardize. The teaching of mathematics in the Eda Ba'a reflected this historical evolution. Students began with concrete counting and measurement. They learned to recognize and write numbers in contexts where they were attached to specific goods. They memorized various measure systems. These included volume measures for grain, weight measures for metals, and area measures for fields. These systems were not always neatly integrated. Different commodities used different units. Converting between them required memorizing complex equivalencies. Only gradually did students move toward more abstract mathematical thinking. They approached problems involving pure numbers manipulated according to systematic rules. You set down the multiplication table and pick up another tablet from the collection before you. This one contains a different kind of mathematical text. It is a problem with a geometric diagram. The diagram shows a rectangle with dimensions marked in cuneiform numbers. The problem, as Kramer would explain, asked for area calculation. It also asked how the rectangle could be divided. This involved creating smaller sections of specific proportions. This kind of problem reflects real practical concerns. A field needed to be divided among multiple owners or workers. A building plot needed to be laid out with specific rooms of specific sizes. The ability to visualize these divisions geometrically and to calculate them numerically was essential. The geometric thinking embedded in these problems suggests that Sumerian mathematics was not purely numerical, but also spatial. Students learned to see numbers as representing real physical quantities. These included lengths, areas, and volumes. They learned to move fluidly between numerical calculation and geometric visualization. This integration of arithmetic and geometry was sophisticated and practical. It suited a civilization that was constantly building, measuring, and organizing physical space. Kramer pointed out that some Sumerian mathematical texts dealt with more abstract or theoretical questions. These questions went beyond immediate practical application. There were problems involving progressions and series. These seemed designed to test mathematical ingenuity rather than to solve real administrative challenges. There were calculations of extraordinarily large numbers that could not represent any actual quantity a scribe would encounter. These texts suggest that some Sumerian mathematicians found intellectual pleasure in numbers for their own sake. They enjoyed pushing the system to see what it could do. But even these more abstract explorations had pedagogical value. They trained students to think systematically. They learned to follow complex logical sequences. They checked their work for consistency. A student who could solve a difficult abstract problem demonstrated mental discipline and precision. This served them well in more routine calculations. The Sumerians may not have distinguished between practical and theoretical mathematics as sharply as we do. All mathematical knowledge was potentially useful. All of it demonstrated the scribe's command of a powerful intellectual tool. The physical act of mathematical notation was itself a learned skill. Writing numbers required the same careful control of the stylus as writing words. It required the same attention to sign formation and placement. A poorly written number could be misread. This could lead to serious consequences. Students practiced writing numbers repeatedly. They practiced just as they practiced writing word signs. Eventually, the notation became automatic and reliable. The practice tablets show this progression from clumsy first attempts to confident, clear notation. However, something else preserved in these mathematical tablets particularly fascinated Kramer. It was the evidence of calculation methods. The Sumerians did not have paper for scratch work. However, they sometimes showed their working on tablets. This was particularly true for more complex problems. You can see intermediate steps and partial results. Sometimes even errors were made and then corrected. These glimpses reveal how Sumerian scribes thought through problems. They show the mental or notational strategies they employed. One common strategy was breaking complex problems into simpler sub-problems. A difficult area calculation might be handled by dividing an irregular shape. It would be divided into regular rectangles and triangles. Each part would be calculated separately. Then the results would be summed. Modern students still learn this decomposition strategy. Seeing it in 4,000-year-old tablets reveals its fundamental nature. Certain problem-solving approaches emerge naturally from mathematics itself. They are not culturally specific. Another strategy, visible in the tablets, is checking through approximation. A scribe might solve a problem precisely. They would then also calculate a rough approximation. This verified that the precise answer was in the correct range. If calculating a field's area gave a result of 2,000 square units, an approximation would also be made. If that approximation suggested a result closer to 3,000, an error was clear. The scribe then needed to recalculate. This practice of verification was explicitly taught. It meant not simply trusting a first answer. It was a key part of mathematical training. The tablet you are now examining contains a particularly interesting type of problem. Kramer wrote about it extensively. These problems involved combinations and distributions. One problem asked about distributing a certain amount of grain among workers. Different classes of workers received different amounts according to their status. The problem required calculating how much each class received. These problems required understanding proportional thinking. This involved being able to work with ratios and fractions. They also required understanding the social hierarchy. One had to know that supervisors received more than ordinary laborers. Skilled craftsmen received more than unskilled workers. Mathematical training was never purely mathematical. It was always embedded in and reflecting the social world the scribes inhabited. To solve distribution problems correctly, you needed to know the proper social relationships. To solve commercial problems, you needed to know standard exchange rates and market practices. To solve building problems, you needed to understand construction techniques and material properties. Mathematics was not separate from other knowledge. It was integrated into a comprehensive understanding of how Sumerian society functioned. This integration helps explain why mathematical training was so central to scribal education. A scribe who could not calculate was essentially useless in most administrative contexts. Scribes might write beautifully. They might also memorize vast quantities of literary texts. However, they could not fulfill their basic professional functions without calculating grain taxes or brick requirements. Mathematics was not an optional add-on to literacy. It was a core component of what literacy meant in practical terms. Kramer's translations revealed that students sometimes struggled with mathematics more than with other aspects of their education. The School Days text provides vivid details about daily school life. It mentions students being beaten for errors in mathematical work. Other school texts refer to students who excelled at copying literary texts but found numerical calculations difficult. This variation in aptitude is hardly surprising. People have always varied in their mathematical abilities. However, this created challenges for the educational system. How much mathematical competence was required to graduate? Could someone become a scribe specializing in literary or religious texts with only minimal mathematical training? Or was mathematical mastery non-negotiable, a prerequisite for any scribal position? The evidence suggests that there was some flexibility. Different scribal careers required different levels of mathematical expertise. A scribe working in a temple copying religious texts might get by with basic arithmetic. A scribe managing a large agricultural estate needed advanced calculation skills. A scribe involved in long-distance trade needed to be comfortable with complex conversions and valuations. The I-Dub-Ba-Ah had to prepare students for this range of possibilities. It provided enough mathematical training so that any graduate could function competently in whatever position he eventually secured. You notice that the mathematical tablet you are holding has annotations in the margins, small additional notes that seem to be explanatory comments or reminders. Kramer found these annotations fascinating because they provided glimpses into the pedagogical process. A teacher might add a note explaining why a particular method was used. They might also warn about a common error. Sometimes they provided an alternative approach to the same problem. These annotations transformed the tablet from a mere record of a problem and its solution. It became a teaching tool. Students could study and learn from it even in the teacher's absence. This raises an important point about the materiality of Sumerian education. Unlike oral instruction, which disappears as soon as it is spoken, the clay tablets created a persistent record. A student could return to a problem repeatedly. He could study the solution at his own pace. He could also compare his own approach to the model solution. This persistence was valuable for learning complex mathematical techniques that might not be fully understood on first explanation. You could work through the problem yourself, check against the model, identify where your thinking went wrong, and try again. The multiplication tables and reciprocal tables that students memorized were themselves preserved on tablets that served as reference materials. Even after you had memorized the tables, you might occasionally need to consult them to check a value you were uncertain about. The tablets thus functioned both as learning tools and as ongoing reference works, blurring the line between education and professional practice. The techniques learned as a student were the same ones used as a working scribe. The reference materials used in school were also kept in a professional archive. Kramer noted that some mathematical tablets were clearly created by teachers as exemplary solutions, models of how problems should be approached. These tablets were often exceptionally well written, with clear diagrams and step-by-step explanations. They represented best practices, the crystallization of centuries of mathematical experience. When a student copied these model solutions, he was not just learning the answer to one specific problem. He was internalizing a method, a way of thinking that could be applied to similar problems in the future. But what did the Sumerians understand about why their mathematical methods worked? Did they have anything like mathematical proof or justification of their procedures beyond the empirical fact that they produced correct results? This was a difficult question to answer from the surviving evidence. The mathematical tablets are generally practical and computational, rather than theoretical or explanatory. They show you how to solve problems, but they rarely explain why the methods work. There were a few texts that seemed to gesture toward more conceptual understanding. Some geometric problems included statements that might be interpreted as general principles. For instance, they observed that the area of a rectangle is always the product of its length and width. This was true regardless of the specific dimensions. But these statements were brief and embedded in practical contexts. There was nothing like Euclid's systematic geometry, with its axioms, definitions, and proofs. Sumerian mathematics was primarily algorithmic. These were collections of procedures that worked. They had been tested through long practice, but were not necessarily justified through abstract reasoning. This algorithmic character made Sumerian mathematics very teachable. Students could learn to follow the procedures without necessarily understanding the underlying mathematical principles. A student might correctly calculate the area of a complex shape. He could do this by breaking it into parts and summing them. He did this without really understanding why the method was valid. He had learned a technique, a recipe for solving a certain kind of problem. He could apply that technique reliably, even without deep conceptual understanding. But Kramer was careful to note that this should not be taken as evidence that the Sumerians lacked mathematical sophistication. The procedures they developed were often remarkably efficient and ingenious. Their approximation methods for square roots and cube roots, for instance, showed real insight into numerical relationships. Their solutions to what we would call quadratic equations demonstrated advanced algebraic thinking. These problems involved unknown quantities whose squares needed to be calculated. The Sumerians lacked algebraic notation, however. The Sumerians were sophisticated mathematical practitioners, even if they were not mathematical theorists in the Greek mold. The tablet you are examining now is different from the others. It is larger, heavier, and the writing is more formal. This appears to be an administrative document rather than a school text. It is a record of grain distributions from a temple storehouse over the course of 1 year. Column after column of entries, each noting a date, a quantity of grain, and a recipient. At the bottom, a total, the sum of all the distributions for the year. Next to that total, another number showed the amount that should remain in the storehouse. This was calculated by subtracting the distributions from the original supply. This was mathematics in action, mathematics as it actually functioned in Sumerian society. The scribe who created this tablet had to perform dozens of additions to arrive at the annual total. He had to perform a subtraction to calculate the remaining supply, and he had to do all of this accurately because his work would be checked. Errors could mean serious consequences, such as accusations of theft or negligence, loss of his position, or public humiliation. The stakes of mathematical accuracy were high. Archaeologists excavated tens of thousands of such administrative tablets. This demonstrated why mathematical training was so central to scribal education. This was the actual work that most scribes spent most of their time doing. This included recording transactions, calculating totals, tracking inventories, and verifying accounts. The literary texts that modern scholars find so interesting were only a small part of scribal output. These included hymns, myths, and wisdom literature. The bulk of cuneiform writing was administrative and economic, and it was fundamentally mathematical. Kramer emphasized this point repeatedly in his work. He wanted readers to understand that Sumerian scribes were not primarily poets or priests, though some filled those roles. They were administrators, accountants, and managers of complex economic systems. Their mathematical training was not a sidebar to their literary education. In many ways, it was the core of what made them valuable. Temples, palaces, and wealthy individuals employed them. But there was a paradox here that was worth considering. The administrative tablets, for all their quantity and importance, were also the most monotonous and least interesting to modern readers. They were lists of numbers. They also contained repetitive entries that rarely told us anything beyond the bare economic facts they recorded. The literary tablets, though far fewer in number, were the ones that captured our imagination. They seemed to offer access to Sumerian thoughts and feelings. Kramer himself spent much of his career translating and analyzing literary texts. He acknowledged that they represented only a fraction of cuneiform writing. This created a skewed picture of what scribal work actually entailed. A student in the Adab Ba'e might dream of composing beautiful hymns or recording the deeds of kings. However, the reality was different. Most of his professional life would probably involve calculating grain rations and tallying livestock. The tension existed between the aspirational aspects of scribal culture and the practical realities of administrative drudgery. This included the literary texts and the claims to wisdom and eloquence. Students had to come to terms with this as they progressed through their education. Yet the Sumerians themselves seemed to find dignity and even beauty in numerical precision and systematic record-keeping. The administrative tablets, for all their apparent dryness, were often meticulously crafted. The numbers were clearly written, the columns were carefully aligned, the totals were double-checked. There was pride in accuracy, There was pride in maintaining reliable records. There was also pride in contributing to the smooth functioning of institutions. These institutions fed thousands of people and organized vast economic resources. This pride might not be immediately apparent to us, but it is there in the care taken with even routine administrative documents. You set aside the administrative tablet and return to the school texts. One tablet caught your attention. It contained what appeared to be a mathematical problem stated in narrative form, almost like a story problem. Kramer translated several of these, and they revealed how mathematical instruction was sometimes embedded in more engaging contexts. The problem described a scenario. A field worker had to dig a canal of certain dimensions. He could move a certain amount of earth per day. The problem then asked how many days the work would take. The problem required calculating the volume of earth to be moved. It then required dividing by the daily rate to get the time required. But notice what else this problem does. It contextualizes the mathematics in a realistic work scenario. It reminds the student that these calculations have real-world reference. Mathematics is not abstract symbol manipulation. Instead, it is a tool for managing actual projects and actual labor. It also, perhaps subtly, reinforces the social position of the scribe. The student solving this problem is not imagining himself as the field worker digging the canal. He is imagining himself as the administrator planning the project. This person needs to know how long it will take. This knowledge helps him organize supplies, schedule other tasks, and coordinate with other work crews. Mathematics positions the scribe as the organizer. This is the one who thinks ahead and calculates, rather than the one who simply labors. This social dimension of mathematical education is easy to overlook, but important to recognize. The A-dub-ba-ah trained students, not just in technical skills. It also taught them a certain way of relating to the world. They learned to be measurers, calculators, and planners, rather than merely doers. The scribe's power came partly from his literacy. It also stemmed from his numeracy. This included his ability to quantify and organize what others experienced only as immediate physical reality. A farmer might know his field intimately. He might understand its soil and its drainage. He might have decades of practical experience working the land. However, the scribe could measure the field and calculate its area. He could determine its tax obligation and record its ownership. In doing so, he transformed the farmer's lived experience into official knowledge. This became data that could be stored, transmitted, and used in decision-making. Kramer was sensitive to these power dynamics, though he did not always make them explicit. His work documented a society that was fundamentally hierarchical. Literacy and numeracy were tools of control as well as tools of administration. The scribal schools were not just neutral institutions transmitting knowledge. They were mechanisms for reproducing social hierarchy. They ensured that children of elite families acquired skills to maintain their elite positions. Mathematical training was part of this reproduction of inequality. It was knowledge most people could not access. It required resources and time that most families did not have. However, it opened doors to positions of relative comfort and authority. Yet within this hierarchical system, there was also meritocracy of a sort. A student who demonstrated exceptional mathematical ability might advance farther and faster than one who struggled with calculations, regardless of family background. The texts mention prodigies. These were students who mastered complex mathematics quickly and were recognized for their talents. Mathematical ability was valued and rewarded. This created at least some room for advancement based on demonstrated competence rather than solely on family connections. The tablet you are now examining presents a different kind of mathematical content. It is a table of astronomical data. It includes numbers representing the positions of celestial bodies. It also contains calculations of lunar phases and predictions of eclipses. This reminds you that Sumerian mathematics was not limited to economic administration. It was also applied to understanding the heavens. This meant tracking the movements of stars and planets. These were believed to be divine beings whose actions had significance for earthly affairs. The astronomical texts required sophisticated mathematics. This involved recognizing cycles and periods. It also included making predictions based on observed patterns. Furthermore, it required calculating positions using geometric models. Scribes who specialized in this kind of work needed advanced training. They occupied a somewhat different social position than purely administrative scribes. They were more closely associated with religious institutions. Their work involved divination, prophecy, and interpreting divine will through celestial signs. Their mathematical work had spiritual significance. It connected earthly knowledge to cosmic order. Kramer noted that the Sumerian understanding of the cosmos was fundamentally mathematical. The movements of celestial bodies followed regular patterns. These were expressible in numbers and ratios. The calendar itself was a mathematical construct. It coordinated the lunar month of approximately 29.5 days. It also coordinated the solar year of approximately 365.25 days. This was achieved through a system of intercalation. Intercalation meant adding extra months at calculated intervals to keep the calendar aligned with the seasons. This required careful record-keeping over many years. It also needed sophisticated calculation to determine when intercalation was necessary. Students in the AWBAR who showed aptitude for astronomical mathematics might be directed toward this specialization. They would memorize astronomical tables just as others memorized multiplication tables. They would learn to recognize patterns in celestial data. They would also learn to make predictions and calculate the dates of future astronomical events. This work required patience because astronomical cycles are long. Understanding them required compiling observations over years or even generations. It also required confidence in mathematical methods. This included the belief that calculation could reliably predict the future behavior of the gods themselves. But there is something profound here about what mathematical thinking enabled. It allowed the Sumerians to see order in what might otherwise have seemed chaotic or arbitrary. The heavens were not just a random scattering of lights. They were a systematic pattern that could be described, predicted, and understood through numbers. Similarly, the economy was not just a confusing flux of goods and exchanges. It was something that could be tracked, measured, and controlled through numerical records. Mathematics was a way of imposing cognitive order on complexity. It made the world legible and manipulable. This ordering function of mathematics had ideological implications. It suggested that the world was fundamentally orderly. It proposed that divine and natural processes followed rules. It also stated that human intelligence could grasp and work with those rules. This was a form of optimism. It represented a confidence in human cognitive capacity that undergirded Sumerian civilization. The temple storehouses worked because mathematical record-keeping made them work. The irrigation systems functioned because mathematical planning made them function. The calendar kept society synchronized because mathematical calculation kept it synchronized. Mathematics was thus deeply implicated in the Sumerian sense that they had created something remarkable. Their cities and institutions represented a triumph of human organization over chaos. The student studying mathematics in the AWBAR was being inducted into this worldview as much as into specific computational techniques. He was learning to see the world as the Sumerians saw it. They viewed it as measurable, calculable, and subject to numerical analysis and control. This way of seeing has been extraordinarily influential in human history. It is essentially the worldview that underlies modern science and technology. This is the belief that reality can be described mathematically. Mathematical description then gives us power to predict and manipulate. The Sumerians did not originate this worldview from nothing. They built on earlier developments in counting and measurement. However, they systematized it and taught it deliberately. They made it a core component of educated consciousness. Yet for all this systematization, Sumerian mathematics retained practical limitations. Their arithmetic was cumbersome compared to modern methods. If one tried multiplying large numbers using Sumerian techniques, one would appreciate why calculators were invented. Their geometry, while sophisticated in some respects, lacked the deductive structure that Greek geometry would later develop. Their understanding of mathematical relationships was largely empirical. They knew what worked without necessarily understanding why in any deep sense. These limitations did not prevent them from achieving impressive practical results. However, they did constrain how far mathematical thinking could develop within their cultural framework. Kramer was sometimes asked whether the Sumerians had advanced mathematics comparable to later Greek achievements. His answer was nuanced. In terms of practical calculation and problem-solving, Sumerian mathematics was highly advanced. It was also adequate for all the purposes it served. In terms of theoretical understanding and systematic proof, it was less developed. But these are different kinds of mathematical achievement. They reflect different cultural priorities. The Greeks valued knowledge for its own sake. They pursued mathematics as philosophy and sought universal truths. The Sumerians valued knowledge for its utility. They pursued mathematics as administration and sought effective solutions to concrete problems. Neither approach is inherently superior. They are different, reflecting different social and intellectual contexts. As you continue examining the mathematical tablets spread before you, a pattern emerges. Almost all of them share certain characteristics. These include precision in notation, systematic organization, and attention to verification and checking. These are not just mathematical traits. They are habits of mind and ways of approaching problems that extend beyond mathematics itself. A student learned to calculate carefully and to check his work. He learned to organize information systematically and to break complex problems into manageable parts. That student was developing cognitive habits. These habits would serve him in all aspects of scribal work, not just the mathematical portions. This is perhaps the deeper significance of mathematical education in the Edab Ba'a'a. Yes, students were learning specific computational techniques they would need in their professional work, but they were also developing a mental discipline, a way of thinking carefully and systematically that marked them as educated professionals. The scribe's authority derived partly from his technical knowledge. It also came from the trust that he could think clearly, work carefully, and produce reliable results. Mathematical training cultivated these qualities in ways that other forms of learning might not. Yet there is a question that the tablets do not answer. This is a question about the emotional or subjective experience of mathematical learning. Did students find mathematics fascinating or tedious? Did they experience the satisfaction of solving a difficult problem? Did they have the moment when a pattern suddenly becomes clear? Or was it all just rote memorization and mechanical application of procedures? The preserved texts give us the mathematics, but not the mathematician's inner life. This means not the lived experience of grappling with numbers and geometric relationships. Kramer, in his more reflective moments, acknowledged this gap in our understanding. He could reconstruct what was taught and how. However, the question of what students felt about their mathematical education remained largely inaccessible. We can make educated guesses. Probably some students loved mathematics, while others struggled through it resentfully, much as today. But without autobiographical texts or detailed personal accounts, we are left with uncertainty about the subjective dimension of Sumerian mathematical learning. What we can say is that mathematics was unavoidable. Unlike literary studies, where a student might focus on certain types of texts and neglect others, mathematical competence was non-negotiable. Every scribe needed at least basic numeracy. Most needed considerably more than that. The tablets show students at all levels working through mathematical exercises. This suggests that numerical training continued throughout the educational process rather than being confined to an early phase of learning. The tablets also show errors. In fact, many errors were present. Students made mistakes in calculation, in notation, and in applying procedures. These errors were corrected. Sometimes annotations explained what went wrong. This record of error and correction is quite valuable. It shows the learning process in action. Mathematical knowledge was not simply transferred from teacher to student. Rather, it had to be actively constructed through practice. This construction involved making and correcting mistakes. It also meant gradually internalizing patterns and procedures. One particular error pattern appears frequently in student tablets. These were place value confusions. Students would correctly perform a calculation. However, they would write the result with the wrong magnitude. They were off by a factor of 60 or 3,600. This happened because they misunderstood the positional value of the signs. These errors suggest that place value notation was conceptually difficult. This was true despite its elegance and efficiency. It required understanding that a sign's meaning depended on its position. The same sign could mean 1 or 60 or 3,600 depending on context. This abstraction was challenging for students. They were still accustomed to thinking of numbers as representing concrete quantities. Teachers developed strategies for helping students avoid these errors. Some tablets show teachers explicitly marking the magnitude. They added clarifying notes. They also used spacing and layout to make place values clearer. These pedagogical innovations emerged from practical experience with student difficulties. The educational system was not static. Instead, it adapted and refined its methods. This was based on what worked and what did not work in actual teaching practice. As the afternoon light shifted and the tablets before you cast long shadows, you realized that you had been examining these mathematical texts for hours. The numbers and problems had started to blur together. You were experiencing something similar to what Sumerian students must have felt. This was the fatigue of sustained numerical work. It involved the mental effort of constant calculation and verification. This fatigue was itself revealing. It reminded you that mathematical learning was labor. It demanded concentration and effort over extended periods. The students in the A-Dub Ba'a were not passively receiving information. Instead, they were actively working. That work was genuinely tiring. However, perhaps there were also moments of genuine intellectual pleasure. These were moments when mathematical relationships suddenly made sense. A difficult problem yielded to systematic analysis. The student experienced his own growing competence. These moments would not necessarily leave traces in the archaeological record. However, they were part of what must have sustained students through years of demanding study. Learning can be intrinsically rewarding. Mathematics, for those who develop facility with it, offers particular satisfactions. This includes the elegance of a clever solution. It also includes the power of being able to calculate what others can only guess at. Furthermore, it provides a sense of mastery over abstraction. The Sumerian scribal student copied his multiplication tables in the dim light of the A-Dub Ba'a. He could not have known how his mathematical training connected him to a longer human story. This was the gradual development of quantitative thinking. It progressed from concrete counting to abstract mathematics. This development would eventually lead to calculus, statistics, and computer science. It also led to all the mathematical apparatus of modern civilization. He knew only that he needed to memorize these tables. He had to master these procedures. He needed to develop these skills if he wanted to succeed as a scribe. But in doing so, he was participating in something larger than himself. He was contributing to the accumulation and transmission of mathematical knowledge across generations. That knowledge, preserved in clay, connects us to those ancient students. It was recovered millennia later by scholars like Kramer. When we solve a geometric problem or calculate a ratio, we are using mental tools. These tools have roots stretching back to Sumerian classrooms. The specific notation has changed. The computational methods have evolved. However, the fundamental project remains recognizably the same. This project involves using numbers to understand and organize reality. The Sumerian scribal student and the modern engineering student share the same enterprise. They are separated by millennia, but united by mathematical thinking. As you carefully set down the last tablet, you prepare to leave this imagined archive. You are left with a question. The evidence prompts it, but does not definitively answer it. What would Sumerian mathematics have become? This is unknown if their civilization had continued to develop. What if the scribal tradition had not eventually broken? Would they have moved toward more theoretical, proof-based mathematics? Like the Greeks? Would they have developed new computational techniques or more efficient algorithms? Or would their mathematics have remained fundamentally practical? Would it have been adequate for administrative purposes, but not extending far beyond them? These counterfactual questions have no answers. However, they remind us that the mathematical knowledge we possess is not inevitable. It is not the only possible path human quantitative thinking might have taken. It is the product of specific historical developments, choices made, and paths followed by particular civilizations. This includes the Sumerians, who began this journey so long ago in the cities of ancient Mesopotamia.